What happens when a quiet, unassuming black man is humiliated in first class by flight attendants, only for them to learn he's the father of Jacob Williams, the CEO of SkyElite Airlines? Watch as Martin Williams and his son reshape the company's future and expose deep-rooted biases within. Comment where you're watching from so everyone can join in, and enjoy the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you find this story captivating. At a bustling airport terminal, Martin Williams, a senior black man dressed in simple, well-worn clothing, walked toward the gate for his flight. His casual attire, a dark hoodie and slightly faded jeans, stood in stark contrast to the polished, high-end passengers crowding the area. He carried a modest, worn backpack slung over his shoulder. His gaze was calm, yet resolute, unaffected by the hurried, sometimes judgmental glances from others. What no one in the terminal could know was that Martin was not just any ordinary traveler. He was the father of Jacob Williams, the powerful CEO of a leading tech company and the owner of SkyElite Airlines, one of the most prestigious airlines in the world. Despite his son's success, Martin preferred a quiet, humble life, far from the media spotlight. He had never flaunted his wealth or made use of his son's influence, instead choosing to live a modest, peaceful existence. Today, however, he would unknowingly become the center of attention, and not for the reasons anyone would expect. As he waited in line to board SkyElite Airlines Flight 302 to New York, Martin ordered a simple black coffee at the terminal cafe. The young barista smiled warmly, asking, "Where are you headed today, sir?" "To New York," Martin replied gently, his voice kind yet soft. "It's a special place, you know. My late wife and I spent the best years of our lives there." His smile carried a nostalgic warmth, but there was a fleeting sadness in his eyes as memories of his late wife surfaced. He took his coffee and slowly made his way to the gate. His simple, unassuming nature blended seamlessly with the other travelers, none of whom had any idea that the quiet man in front of them was the father of the billionaire tech mogul and airline owner, Jacob Williams. As the announcement for first-class passengers to board was made, Martin walked calmly toward the priority area. He ignored the curious glances from the well-dressed passengers around him, who were clearly confused by his unpretentious appearance. Dressed as he was, it was almost unimaginable for them that he could belong in the exclusive section of the aircraft. Unbeknownst to Martin, his simple attire would soon be the catalyst for a series of events that would forever change his life and the lives of many others aboard this flight. As he boarded the plane, the first-class cabin looked luxurious, with soft leather seats and a faint scent of expensive perfume hanging in the air. Martin glanced at his seat number on the ticket, 2A, and moved down the aisle. He noticed the eyes of several passengers on him, but he maintained his composure, making his way to the window seat. However, his calm demeanor would soon be met with suspicion. Near the entrance, a young flight attendant named Rebecca Turner, with her blonde hair neatly pulled back, watched Martin with a mix of confusion and discomfort. She clearly couldn't understand why a man dressed so simply would be seated in first class. Behind her, another flight attendant, Daniel, a tall man with a constantly pleasant smile, approached. His demeanor was polite, but there was a clear shift in his tone when he turned to Rebecca. "Are you sure this gentleman is in the right seat?" he whispered to her, casting a suspicious glance at Martin. "I think we should check," Rebecca murmured back, lowering her voice but still managing to let the condescension seep through. "I've never seen someone dressed like that up here. Are you sure he's not in the wrong section?" Her words, though quiet, were laced with implicit judgment, as if her brain simply couldn't accept the notion that someone who looked like Martin, dressed so plainly, would belong in first class. Martin continued to sit silently, reading a book from his backpack, seemingly unaware of the whispers circulating behind him. But the discomfort he felt was familiar. Throughout his life, he had encountered this kind of quiet, yet sharp judgment. It was a subtle discrimination he had grown accustomed to, but one he never quite learned to accept. The conversation between Rebecca and Daniel caught the attention of Caroline Hayes, the head flight attendant for first class. Caroline, with her meticulously styled brown hair and sharp features, surveyed Martin from a distance. She prided herself on her ability to identify the elite passengers she served. When she saw Martin, something about him didn't sit right with her. Her mind immediately categorized him as someone who didn't belong in the first-class section. "Check his name," she instructed Rebecca coldly, glancing over at Martin one last time. As Rebecca and Daniel exchanged a few more whispered comments, Martin remained calm, completely unaware of the growing tension around him. He only wanted to enjoy his flight in peace, but the judgment of others, especially from the staff, was beginning to weigh on him. The tension in the first-class cabin grew palpable as Caroline Hayes, the head flight attendant, watched Martin Williams. His simple, worn clothing didn't fit her image of a first-class passenger, and her suspicions deepened. She watched him for a moment longer before speaking to Rebecca Turner, the other flight attendant. "Check his name," Caroline instructed coldly. "We need to confirm his seat. First class is for our special guests, and he doesn't exactly fit the profile." Rebecca, clearly uncomfortable but too obedient to question, nodded and walked over to Martin, her voice sweet but carrying a hint of judgment. "Excuse me, sir. May I see your boarding pass again?" Martin looked up from his book, his expression calm but keenly aware of the change in atmosphere. He slowly pulled out his boarding pass, offering it to Rebecca. "Here you go. Seat 2A, he said, his voice steady. Rebecca took the pass but didn't immediately confirm the seat. Instead, she studied it, casting him a glance full of skepticism. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, her tone dripping with doubt. "I purchased this ticket, just like anyone else," Martin replied, keeping his voice firm. "There's no mistake." Behind Rebecca, Caroline watched the exchange with growing unease. Martin didn't belong in her world of polished professionals and perfectly tailored suits. He wasn't supposed to be here, at least not in her eyes. The seconds stretched long as Rebecca hesitated. Finally, she handed the boarding pass back to Martin, but her words came out too sharp, laden with implications. "I just want to be sure," she said, her voice laced with condescension. "You don't exactly look like our typical first-class passengers." At that moment, Martin could feel the weight of the judgment. He wasn't just being asked to prove his seat. He was being questioned because of his appearance and the assumptions they had about him. He had dealt with this his entire life, the quiet discrimination, the looks of doubt. But he wasn't about to back down. "I fully understand where I am seated, ma'am," he said, his voice steady and strong. "I've paid for this ticket, and I expect to be treated like any other passenger here." Caroline stepped forward, her gaze cold. "Sir, first class is reserved for a very select group of people, and I'm afraid you don't fit that description." The tension in the air thickened. Other passengers began to notice the exchange. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others avoided looking directly at Martin or the flight attendants, but all felt the shift in energy. Martin kept his composure, though the sting of discrimination burned inside him. "I don't think there's any mistake here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm in the right seat, and I won't be moved unless you give me a good reason." The room fell into a heavy silence. Caroline wasn't accustomed to this kind of resistance. Most passengers in her experience would have folded under pressure, but Martin didn't waver. His words were clear, unyielding. "If you're so sure you belong," Caroline said, her voice now harsher, "then perhaps you could show some identification." "That's unreasonable," Martin replied, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. "I've already shown you my boarding pass. Asking me for additional ID just because of the way I look is unfair." Caroline's expression flickered with annoyance, but she quickly masked it with a thin smile. "I'm afraid that's the procedure. We need to be certain." Martin shook his head. "I've shown you everything required. If you doubt my presence here, the problem isn't with my seat or my ticket, it's with your assumptions." Around them, passengers had fallen silent. Some exchanged glances, a few whispered under their breath, but none spoke out. Martin could feel their eyes on him, but his focus remained unbroken. He wasn't about to let this slide, not anymore. He had every right to be there. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, his eyes never leaving Caroline's. As the tension in the cabin reached its peak, Caroline Hayes stood over Martin Williams, her cold gaze unwavering. The exchange between them had grown unbearable, and for a brief moment, even Rebecca Turner looked uncomfortable. Martin's calm resolve seemed to be wearing them down, but Caroline refused to back down. She wasn't accustomed to being challenged in her own domain, especially by someone who, in her mind, didn't belong. "I'm sorry, sir," Caroline said, her voice now tinged with frustration. but we can't allow passengers to sit in first class without proper verification. It's a matter of procedure." Martin looked at her, his expression as calm as ever, though his patience was clearly thinning. He had seen the way people like Caroline often wielded power to control situations that had nothing to do with procedure, but everything to do with their own biases. "I've done everything required," he said slowly, deliberately. "I'm not leaving." A heavy silence settled over the cabin as Caroline exchanged an uncertain glance with Rebecca. The passengers had begun to murmur, the tension mounting. No one spoke up in Martin's defense, but there was a palpable sense of discomfort in the air. Some were sympathetic to him, others just uncomfortable with the blatant unfairness unfolding before them. Just as Caroline was about to escalate the situation further, there was a sudden shift in the atmosphere. Martin's phone, which had been quietly sitting on his lap, buzzed. He glanced down, seeing an incoming call. The name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. It was Jacob Williams, his son, the CEO of SkyElite Airlines. He hesitated for only a moment before answering, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. "Hello?" Martin answered, his voice steady despite the tension surrounding him. "Dad!" Jacob's voice came through, sounding both furious and worried. "I've been told what's happening. What's going on? Why are you being treated like this?" The sound of his son's anger was enough to fuel Martin's resolve. He could feel the entire cabin hold its breath as he spoke into the phone, his voice low but filled with quiet authority. "I'm fine, Jacob," Martin said calmly, though his anger was evident in the way he spoke. "But they've decided to make a scene over something that shouldn't even be an issue. They're questioning my right to be here because of the way I look and the way I'm dressed." There was a long pause on the other end, and Jacob's voice came through again, now colder, more commanding. "Don't move, Dad. I'm handling this. Stay where you are." Before Martin could say another word, the phone call ended, and the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to shift. Caroline and Rebecca exchanged uncertain glances, but neither of them made another move. They both realized that they were treading dangerous ground, but neither had yet fully grasped the magnitude of the situation. As they stood there, unsure of how to proceed, the announcement for all passengers to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for takeoff was made, but it was drowned out by the realization that this wasn't just any regular situation. The man they had been questioning was Martin Williams, the father of Jacob Williams, the CEO of the airline they worked for. They had no idea. They had humiliated the very man whose blood ran through the company, and now the truth was about to unfold. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was tense. The flight attendants stood frozen in place as the weight of what had just happened sank in. Martin Williams had remained calm and dignified throughout the entire ordeal, but the situation had taken a sharp turn. Now the truth had come to light. Jacob Williams, the powerful CEO of SkyElite Airlines, was Martin's son. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Martin sat still, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't angry, not at first, but now in the quiet of his seat, he could feel the fury building inside him. He knew the flight attendants hadn't intentionally meant to humiliate him, but the fact that they had so quickly assumed he didn't belong in first class simply because of the way he dressed and the color of his skin made his heart ache. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something much deeper, something that needed to change. Meanwhile, Jacob Williams was on the phone, his anger boiling over. He had just learned that the staff at his own airline had treated his father like an intruder, a nobody, simply because he didn't fit the mold they thought a first-class passenger should. "Martin," Jacob said, his voice shaking with controlled rage. "I'm not letting this go. You don't deserve this, and neither do the other people who face this kind of treatment every day. I'll handle this when we land. They'll know who you are, who you really are, and they'll understand the consequences." The seriousness in his voice gave Martin a sense of calm. His son might be powerful, but Martin knew that power could be used in the right way. This wasn't just about his personal humiliation. This was about something much larger, about changing the culture of the company that Jacob had worked so hard to build. After the plane had landed and passengers began to disembark, Jacob was already on the phone with his senior staff, demanding answers. He was furious, his mind racing with thoughts of how his father had been treated and what it meant for the culture of his company. By the time Martin stepped off the plane, he was met by Jacob in the terminal. His son's face was tight with anger, but when he saw Martin, his expression softened. Jacob walked over to him, pulling him into a brief hug. "I'm so sorry, Dad," he said quietly. "I can't believe this happened, especially here. You shouldn't have been treated like that." Martin smiled faintly, his frustration still simmering, but tempered by the quiet strength he always carried. "It's not about me, Jacob," he said softly. "It's about the system that allowed this to happen. You've worked so hard to build something great, but there are cracks in the foundation. Those cracks are bigger than just a few bad employees." Jacob nodded, the weight of his father's words settling on his shoulders. "I'll handle it. But I won't just fire them and move on. This goes deeper than that. I want real change in this company." Later that day, Jacob called a meeting with his senior leadership team. As the team filed into the conference room, they were unaware that Martin would be joining them. Jacob had a message to deliver, a message that would change the way SkyElite Airlines operated forever. When everyone was seated, Jacob stood at the front of the room, his face stern. "I've just been informed about a situation that occurred on one of our flights today," he began, his voice steady but filled with anger. "A passenger was treated with disrespect by members of our flight staff, members of SkyElite Airlines, simply because of the way he looked. And that passenger was my father, Martin Williams." There was a collective gasp in the room. The senior staff stared at Jacob, shock and disbelief written on their faces. No one had known the truth. "Let me make this clear," Jacob continued. "We will not tolerate this kind of treatment. This isn't about bad apples. This is about a deep-seated culture of unconscious bias that runs through this company. We cannot continue to operate like this, and we will not." The room fell silent. There were no more shocked expressions, no more disbelief. Now there was only a realization. Jacob was not just his father's son. He was the leader of the company, and this incident would change the company forever. "I'm going to take action," Jacob said firmly, his voice unwavering. "We are going to implement a company-wide cultural overhaul. There will be training on racial discrimination and unconscious bias, and we'll begin with a complete review of our policies. If you don't understand what's at stake here, then maybe it's time for you to leave." The room was still, but there was an air of finality in Jacob's voice. He wasn't going to back down. His father had faced discrimination, and now he would ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate. The next few weeks were a blur of changes. Jacob and his leadership team worked tirelessly, revising the company's policies, instituting mandatory training for all employees, and making sure that SkyElite Airlines would never again allow this kind of prejudice to exist in their ranks. For Martin, it was a bittersweet victory. He had been humiliated, but his son's actions had shown him that real change was possible. And even though it was painful, he knew that it was worth it, to ensure that the future would be different for others who face discrimination every day. In the weeks following the incident, Jacob Williams worked relentlessly to ensure the changes at SkyElite Airlines would be lasting. He implemented a sweeping overhaul of the company's internal policies, addressing unconscious bias and promoting racial equality. A mandatory training program was introduced for all employees, with a focus on dismantling the cultural norms that had allowed discrimination to thrive within the company. Jacob's dedication to these changes was unwavering, but the process wasn't immediate. He faced resistance from some of his employees, but he pushed forward, knowing that if he didn't take a stand, the cycle of bias and inequality would continue. Slowly but surely, the culture of SkyElite Airlines began to shift. There was a new focus on respect, empathy, and fairness for all passengers, regardless of their background. Martin Williams, though deeply proud of his son's actions, took a quieter approach. He chose to observe the changes from the sidelines, allowing Jacob to lead the way. However, as the weeks went by, Martin began to notice a subtle but powerful transformation. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted. The flight attendants and passengers, who once might have judged him based on his appearance, no longer looked at him with suspicion. Instead, there was a newfound sense of respect in the way he was treated. The changes were not only on paper, but were evident in the actions of the airline staff. One afternoon, Jacob called his father, his voice full of determination. "Dad, I'm holding a meeting with the board tomorrow. We're going to make sure everyone understands how deep the issue goes. You need to be there with me. Martin felt a mix of pride and apprehension. He knew that the meeting would be a defining moment, not just for SkyElite Airlines, but for the future of the company's commitment to equality. Jacob was ready to face the uncomfortable truths, and Martin would be there to support him, just as he always had. When the day of the meeting arrived, Jacob and Martin entered the boardroom together. The senior leadership team and board members were seated, their faces tense as they awaited Jacob's direction. No one, however, expected Martin to be standing beside his son. The revelation that Martin was Jacob's father hit the room like a shockwave. The very man who had been humiliated by the company's staff just weeks earlier was now standing before them. Jacob addressed the room with a stern voice. "I've called this meeting because, as many of you know, SkyElite Airlines has recently undergone significant changes, but we can't move forward without confronting a painful truth. An incident that occurred on one of our flights, involving my father." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. The board members looked at Martin, their faces flushed with embarrassment and guilt. Jacob continued, his tone resolute. "We cannot continue to operate in an environment where any passenger, regardless of their background, is treated with disrespect. Martin is here today to remind all of us of the human cost of these biases. This is not just a company issue, it's a moral issue." Martin stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here for personal revenge. I'm here because what happened to me is happening to others every day. This is about ensuring that SkyElite Airlines becomes a company where everyone, regardless of their race or appearance, is treated with the respect they deserve." The room fell silent. Martin's words hung in the air, and the gravity of the situation settled on each of the board members. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's mistake. It was about changing the very culture that had allowed such discrimination to persist. After a few moments of heavy silence, David Parker, one of the senior executives, spoke up. "We understand the gravity of what's happened, and we deeply regret our actions. We're committed to making real change." Jacob nodded, his voice steady. "This isn't just about one mistake. It's about creating a culture that values dignity, fairness, and respect for all people. We are committing to making these values central to everything we do." With that, the meeting ended, and the changes continued. SkyElite Airlines began to see the results of its overhaul. It wasn't just about training or policy changes. It was about changing the heart of the company. The passengers felt it, the employees felt it, and Martin knew that this change would extend beyond just the airline. It would inspire others to look at their own prejudices and take action. As the weeks turned into months, Jacob and Martin saw the true impact of their efforts. SkyElite Airlines had become a symbol of positive change. And for Martin, the real victory wasn't in the apology or the policies. It was in the quiet transformation he saw around him every day.